The value of power and wealth and superficial accomplishments, political accomplishments, are a recurrent issue throughout the poem. The 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 lengths to which certain characters go in achieving these superficial values, in pursuing these political ends, are constantly framed in negatives, and probably no more specifically, no more dramatically than in our chapter 8 about the lacquer house. Duryodhana is very concerned with his cousins. He is very jealous. Duryodhana is the eldest and most prominent of his 100 brothers and sisters, eldest son of the blind Dhritarashtra. Again, the names I'm going to just butcher, so I apologize. But he is driven by concern. And this concern is somewhat natural to him because it is inherited. Dhritarashtra is also naturally very insecure, very concerned with worldly accomplishments, worldly position. We're told right at the beginning of the lacquer house, hearing reports of the 5 Pandavas' prowess and strength, Dhritarashtra became filled with anxiety. His nights were sleepless and uneasy. So that characteristic is very prominent in that line of the family. The lengths to which they go to, however, to protect their status in the society at the expense of anything that we might see as moral, or to the contrast of what most definitions of dharma would be, that gets, I would say, some considerable prominence here. Dhritarashtra summoned Kanika, one of his ministers, a man accomplished in the labyrinthine art of politics and intrigue. "Sir, you must be bold," he said. "A king should strike against his enemies before they grow in power. Hide your intentions, then act with single-minded ruthlessness. Each enemy requires a different tactic. The timid should be terrorized. The brave should be conciliated. The covetous kept sweet with gifts, while equals and inferiors should be crushed by a powerful show of arms." This is Machiavelli, quite frankly, and we'll get to Machiavelli, but this is political. This is about crushing your enemies. This is about your worldly status, your ability to control things here on Earth in the hierarchy, in the structure of society. It has nothing to do with any notion of what is right, what is good, what is dharma. It is an effort to control events, to control fate. That is always in the ancient world, and pretty much every civilization of the ancient world. That is always a bit of a red flag. The attempts to control what is natural in the world is always going to be a problem. What is natural in the world, remember the contrast between nature and civilization, what is natural in the world might be that everybody is relatively equal and free, instead of constrained and free, which is the model of civilization, or at least the dream model of civilization, that everybody functions within a very rigid social strata. But here we're seeing the real world efforts to control that in a way that has some disastrous consequences. The Duryodhana is feeding his father's anxiety. Duryodhana is always pressuring the blind Dhritarashtra, who cannot see, and that is why he's a problem. Always stressing the need to take extraordinary measures to control their position of power over the Pandavas. But then the Kaurava, ever vigilant, started to pick up alarming gossip. His informants went about the streets and marketplaces, lingering on corners, loitering in doorways. So it was that Duryodhana's spies reported to him a buzz of restlessness, a new climate. People were clamoring for change. Is that a positive? Is that characterized in a sunny way about vox populi, the voice of the people? His informants went about the streets and marketplaces, lingering on corners, loitering in doorways. That sounds, A, kind of sneaky on their part. They're spies. But also, the buzz of restlessness, a new climate, people were clamoring for change. There is, maybe it's just me here, and again, I'm not going back to the original here, I'm just reading this, but there is a kind of condescension towards, the commoners, the rabble. This is what's being talked about in the street corners and the marketplaces. And, there's a certain suspicion of what's going on amid the lower classes. People were clamoring for change. Clamoring is something that, well, they weren't discussing it in elevated tones. They're clamoring. Clamoring for change, saying, Dhritarashtra isn't up to it. Due to his blindness, he did not inherit. Why is he king now? What kind of king can he be with no eyes in his head? The eldest Pandava, wise beyond his years, should be our king immediately, not later. It's up to us to make our voices heard. All this the spies faithfully reported. Now, actually, despite the somewhat, I would say, and this is me reading between the lines, the somewhat condescending notion towards the ordinary people, there is some reason here. Now, you can say that, he can't be king because he's blind, and of course, today, the whole notion of, he's, he has a disability or he is otherwise abled or whatever, and, you can overcome that, and you can't judge and all that, but don't look at it with these modern notions. The blindness is symbolic in this. You can't really approach Dhritarashtra as a human being as much as a type when you're dealing with ancient literature. And here, the people are saying he can't rule because he's blind. And within the context of the poem, we are told that's more or less true. He has no vision. That's the symbolic meaning of that. So that means he cannot rule. So the people are, in fact, while they are expressing it perhaps inartfully, they are leaning on something that is a legitimate form of political rationale. The eldest Pandava, wise beyond his years, should be our king immediately, not later, as according to the agreement that had been reached. So this is striking at Dhritarashtra's line, striking at Duryodhana's future. Duryodhana wants to be the king, and he has to wait in line. He is lower on the pecking order than his cousins in this. So he wants to control that and change that fate. He has to go and convince his father. We are told the king's heart swithered, hating to hurt his son, his firstborn, his first loved, and he remembered Kanika's stark warning. Hated to hurt his son, his firstborn, his first loved eldest. That's attachment. That's a hierarchy. The firstborn eldest is the hierarchy within the family. So he is very conscious of protecting the hierarchy. And we as readers are here being shown that, well, here the hierarchy seems bad. Duryodhana is a bad guy. But the society of the poem is structured to protect him, to promote him even. And here we see all the machinations being engaged to raise him up even higher than he is. So is the social structure good, or is it a problem? Enough! Cried Duryodhana. I can't stand having to watch those preening Pandavas strut around. They make my life a torment. Father, you raised me as a king's firstborn. I should be king in turn. If you don't listen, if you don't consign me to subservience, I'll kill myself. Now, for those of you who think he's throwing a tantrum here, good. He's throwing a tantrum here. He's being a toddler. While he is arguing that he should be king, he is also demonstrating a very unkingly characteristic of being childish. Daddy, I should be king. It's a funny book. But Duryodhana is not just a child. He takes that instinct, that resentment, that envy, and uses it to fuel what a king's power can execute. And that is destruction. He comes up with the plan basically to incinerate his rivals, incinerate his cousins. They hold a festival. He gives instructions for a grand palace to be built, and he makes it a trap. But look also how he builds this. Always don't just read for the plot. Read for how the plot is being presented. While the preparations were underway, Duryodhana sought out Purachana, his aide, whose loyalty he counted on. There is no ally I trust more than you. Help me, and you will be well rewarded. You must rush ahead to Varanavata. Build a splendid mansion near the armory, especially for the Pandavas, providing every comfort, every kind of pleasure. Call it the House of Wealth. No luxury should be lacking, no sumptuous brocades, couches so soft a man could sleep forever, gold cornices, cool, jasmine-scented courtyards. That will keep my father satisfied. That sounds gorgeous. That sounds beautiful. That sounds sumptuous. That sounds luxurious. It sounds all of these very wealthy, superficial things. It is very superficial beauty that he is dallying in front of everybody, dallying in front of his father to say, look, I'm being nice to my cousins. I'm building them a palace so that they can all stay in for the festival. But under gorgeous tapestries, the walls should be stuffed with straw, oil-drenched and smoothed with gilded wax, the floors crushed travertine, blended with resin, and those elaborate couches positioned under weighty architraves should be soft wood, soaked in butter, gleaming with 20 coats of lac. Let them settle in, let them enjoy themselves without suspicion, and then one windy night while they're asleep, an accidental fire should torch the building and them as well. Purachana understood. Arson. He is luring his cousins in with all of this images of wealth, but in fact the wealth and the superficial values associated with it is a trap that kills. That's strange. He could have done any way of killing them, but here he is doing one that drives another little message or a lesson, let's say, about attachment to superficial beauty, attachment to worldly goods, attachment to wealth. Curious. But of course, the Pandavas, specifically, as we are told, Kani Yudhishthira, the eldest, see through it. They suspect it. They are perceptive. Yudhishthira, while being the most high-minded of all of them, is also the most perceptive in this. He sees, he demonstrates the kingly value of being smart and savvy in a way that isn't so high-minded, you know? The knock against the high-minded is that, well, they don't understand how real people work, so they can't be kings. Here he is demonstrating he can be a king because he understands, my cousin, he's a good guy, but he wants to kill me. And we need to be aware of that. So he is, in the span of just a few stanzas, we go from Duryodhana demonstrating why he shouldn't be king to Yudhishthira demonstrating why he should. Curious. And notice some of the other little details here. For some time, Kunti, the mom, had been providing food and shelter to a poor tribal woman from the forest and her sons, 5 strongly built young men. But she had lately started to suspect that they were spying for Purachana. Before the appointed night, she held a feast for the townfolk, and, as a royal agent, Purachana was invited. Liquor flowed lavishly. Most of the guests went home at last, but Kunti took the forest family to her room, where they fell into a stupor. In the hall, Purachana stretched out and slept as deeply as a sated pig. He did not hear Bhima's cautious footsteps, the soft click of the barricaded floor. He never heard the flames gobble the rafters, nor boiling resin bubble from the floor, the creak, roar, crash as the roof fell in. He did not smell the scent of burning rushes. He breathed the toxic fumes of wax and lacquer and never woke. The fire surged, crackling from room to room, through corridors and stairways, tongues of flame greedy for each other, red, yellow, orange, leaping upward, playful, free, an ecstasy of burning. Meanwhile, the Pandavas had clambered down into the pit, covered it behind them. They ran through the tunnel, out into the air and into the forest. They dodged among the trees, making their way south, and soon the uproar and horror of the city were left behind. So much going on there. So much. Number 1, Mom Kunti lures these people on a suspicion, lures workers on a suspicion that they are spies, gets them drunk, and lets them die. When afterwards people go start sifting through the rubble, they find the bones of 5 young men. And they say, oh, there's the Pandavas. And that is the mom on her suspicions about the workers. They were expendable. Yeah, well, gee, we got to have some bones in there, so let's just get some of those lower class types over there. And, you know, all the flesh will burn off them. I'll get them drunk, so, you know, they're commoners. They're going to get drunk. Get them drunk, they'll die, the flesh will get burned off, and then you get bones. That's all it takes. No DNA evidence back in this era. So, you know, I don't think it's an accident that we're being prodded to think that that's kind of a crappy thing to do. It's a dehumanization of those people, but also of Purachana. In the hall, Purachana stretched out and slept as deeply as a sated pig. Again, another little detail. Purachana is not a major character. We don't need to know that he was there and that, he was so drunk he passed out and that he is compared to a pig. More dehumanization. Significantly, Purachana is singled out by Duryodhana. Duryodhana doesn't really waste a lot of time worrying about him afterwards. So maybe Duryodhana has some qualities, but caring too much about other people isn't necessarily one of them. You can see the depths of his ambition, the heights of his ambition, the cruelty and dehumanization in his soul that is a function of his attachment to worldly goals. That is weighing him down and making him a beast himself. The details that get tossed out, this is another big scene, big sequence, give us little hints as how we're supposed to take this. The Pandavas escape into where? The forest. Where do they head within that? To the south. Remember the geography at play here. The sophisticated cities tend to be in the north. And so here, when they are exiles, when they are fleeing for their lives, when they are seeking safety and succor, they head into nature and they head into, well, the outer boroughs, the sticks. They flee into something more natural from the civilization of the hierarchy that they are leaving behind. And all of these little hints are being tossed out very significantly. When he received the news, Dhritarashtra was torn. Dhritarashtra is always torn, as always. Just as a deep pool is chilly in its depths, warm on the surface, so Dhritarashtra's heart was at the same time hot with instant grief and deeply cold. Dhritarashtra is, in this example, natural. He has a human nature, and that is being expressed as a deep pool, like a pond, an example of nature, but also the natural forces of heat and cold. And he's always torn between these, of course. He can't decide on them. But the nature of human beings, perhaps, ordinary human beings, limited human beings, he is limited, he cannot see, limited human beings, is that they are torn between alternatives, between their emotional states very often, their selfish, ego-driven states so often. Heat can be passion, cold can be indifference. But he is always torn between these, tug one way or the other. And he is a victim of fate and sees himself as a victim of fate instead of rising above it, detaching from the worldly expressions of fate and focusing more on Dharma, on what is right and wrong, on the ideal, the abstract, the divine realm instead of the earthly realm. He had not quite expected these events. He was blind. He and his sons cast off their royal robes and carried out the proper funeral rites. He ordered public mourning kingdom-wide. No outward show of sorrow was omitted. He took a tragedy and he put a social, civilized face on it. He is engaging in ritual, religious practices here, all very superficial in their way. No outward show of sorrow was omitted. But is he really sad? His rivals, or his family line's rivals, have now been obliterated. Is he actually sad? We are not told he is sad. We are told he is torn. Oh no, all my nephews are killed. But on the other hand, my son, my line, will benefit. But he's willing to put on the civilized show of sorrow. He will engage in the practices of the culture, not give in to the natural emotional state that this evokes. He and his sons cast off their royal robes and carried out the proper funeral rites. Royal robes, well, the signs of authority. Clothing is always symbolic. They are putting aside their signs of leadership and putting on a show of, mourning. But underneath is something very different. Underneath, we are not told what they are feeling underneath, but we are being prodded to wonder. We are being nudged into seeing that, oh, okay, well, what we're told isn't necessarily the whole story. The superficial characteristics of the civilization aren't necessarily the whole story. Maybe we need to think about that just a little bit more. Maybe we need to interpret between the lines of the poem, between the lines of the society, and start to wonder about what's behind all of that civilization, what's behind all of the text in front of us. And civilization is a kind of text. It is something to be read. It is something to be interpreted. It is something to be wondered about. But it's a funny thing when you start wondering about a civilization, you start questioning it and saying, well, does it have to be this way? Is that really the best way to be? Of course, the poet, plausible deniability, can say, of course, I say, they put aside their royal robes and they engaged in the funeral rites, and everything was good because that's what they were supposed to do. That is their role in society, and that is good. They fulfill the mandate of their royal role, to recognize the loss of these people and demonstrate that on their level, doing everything that is expected of them. But is that the human reaction? Is that a realistic reaction? Is that a total reaction? That's a much harder question.